Welcome to Debt Matters. If your neighbor stops paying their electricity bill, you might actually end up paying it for them.
Yeah, that is the reality of it.
Right. So whether you are managing a household budget, running a small business, or just trying to understand the economic forces shaping our utility bills, we are talking directly to you today. We're looking at UK household energy debt, which currently sits at around £5.5 billion.
It is a massive number.
It really is. And our mission for this conversation is to connect the dots on a highly complex issue. We want to see how utility suppliers can protect vulnerable customers without letting unpaid balances drive up costs for everyone else.
Exactly. And to put that 5.5 billion in perspective, the regulator Ofgem recently cautioned that if the current trajectory holds, we could be looking at a figure surpassing £7 billion by the end of 2026.
Wow, $7 billion.
Yeah, so this isn't just an abstract accounting issue for utility companies. It's a mounting pressure point that alters the financial landscape for the entire market.
And we are going to look at the facts as they stand. No exaggerations, no claims that this is going to cause the sky to fall. We are simply unpacking the current state of energy arrears to understand the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Right. Because part of that reality is a recent blunt warning from Ofgem's interim chief executive, Tim Jarvis.
What did he say?
Well, he pointed out that fewer households may need to be exempt from paying their energy bills moving forward.
I mean, that sounds pretty strict.
It does, but that warning stems from the very foundation of how the energy market is structured. When we talk about bad debt in this sector, we have to look at the mechanism of how it is socialized.
Meaning the suppliers don't just eat the cost.
Exactly. Suppliers don't just quietly absorb the loss when a bill goes unpaid. They present their bad debt figures to the regulator.
Okay, so Ofgem reviews those numbers.
Right. Ofgem reviews these operational costs and, historically, bakes an allowance for bad debt right into the price cap. That specifically affects the standing charges or unit rates that every single customer pays.
So the costs do not vanish. They're redistributed.
Precisely.
Let's think of the energy market like a massive shared restaurant tab.
I like that analogy.
Imagine you're sitting at a huge table with your community. Everyone is ordering what they need. But at the end of the night, if someone slips out the back door without paying, the restaurant does not just take the loss.
No, they don't.
Right. They hand the remaining diners the difference to cover the missing amount.
That visual captures the financial redistribution perfectly, but we also have to factor in the sheer scale of the administrative burden.
The cost of actually trying to collect the money.
Yes, because when that bad debt increases, the supplier has to hire more collection agents, they have to invest in more recovery software, and handle way more customer service calls.
Which just adds to the bill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of that administrative friction drives up their baseline operating costs, which again feeds right back into the regulator's pricing calculations for the wider public.
But here is where the restaurant analogy breaks down for me.
How?
Well, you can decide to skip ordering a steak or just pass on dessert. But energy is an essential utility, not a luxury.
That is very true.
You cannot just decide to stop heating your home or turning on the lights in the dead of winter. How does the sheer necessity of the product change the way we handle the £5.5 billion on this specific tab?
That is really the defining question. Because the product is a fundamental requirement for health and safety, the standard rules of commercial debt recovery are thrown out the window.
Right, because if you default on a car loan, the lender just repossesses the vehicle.
Exactly. But you cannot repossess electricity that has already been used to heat a kettle, and cutting off someone's supply entirely is an absolute last resort.
I imagine there are massive regulatory barriers there.
Huge barriers, because disconnecting a vulnerable person's power can become a literal life or death scenario.
Which means the debt just sits there.
It does.
And the data shows a huge portion of this $5.5 billion is already more than 90 days overdue. That is 3 whole months of absolute silence from the customer.
And 90 days is a critical threshold in the psychology of debt.
How so?
Well, in the first 30 days, a missed payment might just be an oversight or a temporary cash flow hiccup. But by day 90, the customer has ignored multiple billing cycles, reminder emails, letters, all of it.
So they're just avoiding it entirely.
Yeah, often the balance has compounded to a point where the customer feels paralyzed by the sheer size of the number. The longer that balance sits without a formal repayment plan, the more defensive the customer becomes.
Making fair collection incredibly difficult.
Exactly.
The reality of that aging 90-day overdue debt naturally forces us to ask why the bills aren't being paid in the first place. Are people broke, or are they just ignoring the letters?
That brings us to the most delicate challenge for suppliers, which is identifying true vulnerability from behind a computer screen.
That has to be a massive operational hurdle.
It really is. From the perspective of a billing system, a missed payment looks identical regardless of the human story behind it.
Right, a zero is a zero.
Exactly. Suppliers are tasked with sorting these silent customers into vastly different categories based on highly limited information. They have to figure out if someone is genuinely unable to pay due to chronic financial hardship.
Or if it's just a temporary thing.
Right, if they are temporarily struggling due to a sudden life event like a medical emergency or a job loss.
And it gets more complicated because the data shows two other major categories. You have people who are actively avoiding engagement,
Yes, the active avoiders.
meaning they might actually have the funds, but are choosing to prioritize other spending over the energy bill.
Which happens more often than you'd think.
And then you have just administrative chaos, where a customer might not be properly registered at a property.
Right.
Like someone moves out of a flat, the new tenant doesn't register, and the supplier is sending threatening letters to a ghost while the 90-day clock ticks.
The administrative errors are far more common than people realize. But distinguishing between the other categories.
Like the struggling pensioner versus the high-income avoider.
Yeah, that is where the real friction lies. You would think in the era of big data, companies could just run a profile and know.
Right, they have algorithms for everything now.
They do, and they try to use credit reference agency data, postcodes, historical payment behavior, but that data is often lagged.
Meaning it's out of date by the time they see it.
Exactly. A person with a pristine credit score might have had their bank account drained by an emergency yesterday. The supplier's algorithm wouldn't know that.
So the supplier is kind of flying blind.
Completely blind in many cases.
And if they guess wrong, the stakes are enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, if they treat too many people as exempt from enforcement out of caution, the overall debt skyrockets.
And that shared restaurant tab gets more expensive for everyone else.
But if they swing the pendulum the other way and enforce rigid rules,
they risk inflicting profound harm on households that are already at the breaking point. Demanding a lump sum from someone who literally cannot afford groceries is not just terrible optics.
right, it breaches the regulatory mandate to protect the vulnerable. This tension is exactly what fueled the massive controversy around prepayment meters recently, isn't it?
It is.
Because for a long time, the industry viewed prepayment meters as the ultimate compromise tool for debt recovery.
They did. The mechanics of a prepayment meter seem entirely logical on paper. It's essentially pay-as-you-go energy.
Okay.
If a customer has built up a massive backlog of debt, the supplier switches their meter. Then every time the customer tops up with 10 pounds, perhaps 2 pounds goes toward clearing the old arrears, and the remaining 8 pounds buys current energy usage.
So it allows the supplier to recover the bad debt gradually without demanding an impossible lump sum.
That was the idea, yes.
But the execution was horrific. It wasn't just offering people a new meter. It was forced installations.
Yeah, it really became a crisis.
Suppliers were securing court warrants, entering homes, and changing the meters against the residents' wishes.
And the damage to public trust from those forced installations cannot be overstated. For households in extreme poverty, being forced onto a prepayment meter often leads to what the industry calls self-disconnection.
What does that mean exactly?
It means the supplier doesn't officially cut off the power. The customer simply sits in the dark and the cold because they literally do not have the cash to top up the meter.
Wow, so it entirely bypasses the health and safety protections we discussed earlier.
Exactly. It removes the safeguard entirely.
Let's unpack this for a second. If forced prepayment meters ruin public trust, but doing absolutely nothing leaves the debt unresolved and raises costs for everyone else, aren't suppliers trapped in a completely unworkable situation?
It looks like a trap if you only rely on rigid, reactive tools, but it is not unworkable.
Okay, what's the alternative then?
It requires a fundamental pivot to what the industry terms ethical debt recovery.
Ethical debt recovery.
Yes. This framework moves away from automated enforcement and demands a nuanced evaluation of two distinct factors: a customer's ability to pay and their willingness to engage.
But how do you evaluate someone's willingness to engage if they are terrified of you? I mean, if public trust is broken, people just hide.
That is the core challenge. If a customer fears that picking up the phone will result in a forced meter installation or an aggressive demand for a 500-pound lump sum, they will retreat.
Naturally.
So to break that cycle, suppliers have to overhaul their entire communication strategy. Ethical debt recovery means ensuring that every piece of communication is transparent, non-threatening, and makes it abundantly clear that the action taken will be strictly proportionate to the customer's specific circumstances.
So proportionate action means you treat a high-income earner who is just ignoring your emails very differently than you treat a pensioner on a fixed income who is terrified of the winter cold.
Exactly the point. But to make those proportionate decisions, you need actual human insight, not just an algorithm. And because public trust in those late-stage reactive tools is fractured, suppliers must shift their entire focus upstream. They have to move toward early proactive intervention to solve the problem before the debt ever hits that 90-day mark.
So the recovery playbook has to change entirely. You cannot just play a waiting game and then drop a hammer.
Waiting until arrears are months overdue basically guarantees a low recovery rate. It increases the likelihood of formal complaints, drives up those operational costs we discussed, and entrenches the customer in financial paralysis.
The current guidelines outline a clear early intervention approach. And it doesn't start with red letters.
No, it doesn't.
It starts with simple, clear reminders long before the balance becomes a serious threat.
Yes, and then suppliers need to conduct early checks to actually understand the customer's situation. Those early checks are the most vital part of the new playbook.
Checking if they're even billing the right person.
Exactly. Before sending a collection notice, the supplier needs to verify their property data. Once they establish contact, the goal isn't immediate payment in full.
What is it then?
It's assessing the context. Is this a temporary stumble or a systemic inability to pay? Once that is established, the supplier can offer genuinely affordable, customized repayment plans.
And part of that early intervention is signposting hardship support. If someone is drowning, the supplier's job isn't just to ask for money.
No.
It's to direct them to government grants or debt charities that can actually help them stabilize. But on the flip side, early intervention also means taking fair, swift action when customers can pay but refuse to engage.
Right, because we have to view this within the broader ecosystem of household finance. Energy debt does not exist in a vacuum.
People have other bills.
Exactly. A family missing an electricity payment is almost certainly facing a multitude of concurrent pressures: rising rent or mortgage costs, mounting credit card balances, and council tax demands.
It's a financial triage situation.
Yes.
Think about it. If a family has £100 left at the end of the month, who do they pay? The landlord who can evict them? The local authority that can send bailiffs for council tax? Or the energy supplier who faces massive regulatory hurdles to cut off the power?
The energy supplier usually falls to the bottom of that priority list.
Naturally.
And that is precisely why early action is critical. If the energy company waits 90 days to engage, the customer's limited funds have already been absorbed by more aggressive creditors.
Oh, that makes total sense.
By stepping in early with a supportive, flexible approach, the supplier actually improves their chances of recovering the funds while helping the customer manage the burden.
I want to bring this dynamic directly back to your world for a moment.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because whether you manage commercial accounts, run a small business, or simply balance your own household budget, the golden rule remains the same. Ignoring a balance makes it harder for both the creditor and the debtor.
Absolutely. Silence limits options.
If you owe money, avoiding the call ensures the problem compounds. And if you are owed money, waiting 3 months to send a gentle reminder means you have likely already lost the window for an easy, amicable fix.
The fundamental truth of financial management applies from a £50 personal loan all the way up to £5.5 billion in national energy debt.
It really scales up.
It does.
Yeah.
And the ultimate takeaway from observing this utility crisis is that success relies entirely on a recovery process that is structured, compliant, and fundamentally human-led.
Human-led recovery. That is a stark contrast to the automated systems we are all used to dealing with.
Yes.
It means building infrastructure that actually listens to the person on the other end of the line.
It requires a massive operational shift. You have to train frontline call center staff to hear the hesitation in a customer's voice.
Right, to read between the lines.
Exactly, to recognize the unspoken signs of vulnerability, even when the customer is too proud to admit they are struggling.
That takes a lot of empathy.
It does. It also means implementing flexible software that allows an agent to pause the collections process entirely, giving the customer a breathing space to consult a debt charity without fear of penalty.
Which sounds expensive for the supplier.
It is labor-intensive and costly upfront, but it is the only sustainable way to manage a necessity like energy without causing profound social harm.
And as we've established, letting bad debt spiral out of control simply shifts the financial burden onto everyone else's standing charges. We have to address the root causes and facilitate that early human engagement.
The structural integrity of the entire energy market and the protection of its most vulnerable participants relies on finding and maintaining that delicate equilibrium.
It fundamentally reshapes how we view the relationship between a business and its consumers.
Completely.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder today. If early structured intervention is the proven antidote to this £5.5 billion problem, how might businesses redesign their very first customer touchpoints?
Things like the initial welcome packet.
Right. Or the visual layout of the very first monthly bill.
Yeah.
How can we trigger open communication and support before a customer ever misses a payment?
That's the real challenge moving forward.
It is something to think about as you navigate your own bills or manage your own clients this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate you taking the time to connect the dots on these complex issues with us, and we will catch you on the next one.